So this video is going to be dedicated toward the fan base of both House of the Dragon as well as Game of Thrones. Now, I think this is kind of a touchy subject maybe, because I think there is an equal amount of passion for those that think that House of the Dragon is superior to Game of Thrones, and there's an equal passion on another side that says that House of the Dragon will never match the quality or the scale that Game of Thrones achieved. And you know what? I think both people are right, but I'm going to go ahead and be a little bit more conclusive here and say that House of the Dragon, under any circumstance, it doesn't matter, from the very beginning, it was never going to be able to be grander than Game of Thrones. It was never going to be able to top Game of Thrones. And that's a bit of a contradiction from what I initially thought when House of the Dragon was initially announced a few years ago. The reason why I imagined House of the Dragon as being superior to Game of Thrones really had a lot to do with a couple things. For one, the source material is complete on this era of Westeros. So the Dance of the Dragons, it has occurred. There is an outline from beginning to end of this conflict that we're experiencing here in House of the Dragon. We know how it's going to end, which means the creators of the show know how it's going to end. So they have a roadmap. They know how to get there. And it's outlined, maybe not as nuanced or as detailed as the main series of Song of Ice and Fire, but it is outlined. They know the major events. They know specifically what those events are, even if they don't know precisely how those events maybe unfolded or some of the different character development that would occur during these situations or these conflicts, these battles. The issue, though, with that is that the way Fire and Blood is written compared to A Song of Ice and Fire, while there's definitely unreliable narrators or unreliable perspectives in A Song of Ice and Fire, that's tenfold in Fire and Blood, because we're not actually getting character perspectives or point of view characters, we're getting narrators that are truly just exploring these histories of Westeros that were documented by maesters before their time. So we're getting this idea of how things happen, but we have no clue of how they actually happen. But what that does to the reader is we start to take on some of these biases that are presented to us in the way that information is presented in Fire and Blood, and we start to develop a little bit of headcanon. So we have an idea of what we think would happen. The blacks are kind of demonized by the maesters or the presentation of Fire and Blood, so much so that it's almost obvious that, hey, something's up here. Maybe a lot of the history is written by Green Loyalists. Maybe it's in cahoots with the Old Town Maester conspiracy. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So when we look at Fire and Blood, we read it thinking that the black faction is the good guys. But the reality is there are no good guys. The black faction, the green faction, they're both kind of terrible in their own ways, and the small folk definitely pay the penalty for it. The reason why this makes House of the Dragon kind of peculiar is that there is no depiction, though, that is going to represent entirely the way the reader interpreted the information. So we've got an idea of who these characters are. Even if there's not a whole lot of development, there's essentially no development for many of the characters, but we have an idea of who they are. That's why you'll hear certain fans say they have totally butchered Alicent's character. And you can make that argument, but you could also make the argument that there isn't really a character of Alicent in Fire and Blood that is so defined that we know precisely how this character should be portrayed in House of the Dragon. Now, this pushes back on these ideas of what we hold true. Like, we believe that this information is accurate, even if it's just our own headcanon, or if we are arguing that, no, this is how it's presented in the book, but then you have to kind of concede that the information relayed to the audience or relayed to the reader in Fire and Blood is unreliable. I mean, we've got this character Mushroom that a lot of the information comes from, and he's not available in House of the Dragon. So does that just automatically make House of the Dragon not canonical? Well, perhaps. And I think that you could argue that from the very beginning of House of the Dragon, that this is just a spin on this story told in Fire and Blood This is never going to be 100% faithful or a true adaptation. This is almost fan fiction. And I think you could be justified in believing that. I don't think that's the case. I think that this is as close to a canon version of the Dance of the Dragons that we're ever going to get. I don't think George R. R. Martin is going to elaborate on this conflict much more than he already has, or more so than what we're getting in House of the Dragon. Now, if you go back to A Song of Ice and Fire, there might be contradictions that are presented to us in Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring, if either of those books ever see the light of day, which there's a big concern that they never will. Now, I initially started this by saying that House of the Dragon can never match Game of Thrones. And the biggest reason is really just the context of the literature. If you go back to the novels for A Song of Ice and Fire, well, I mean, look at Game of Thrones, the very first book in the series. It has got to be some of the most efficient writing that you are going to see throughout the entire series. And I'm not saying it's the best book. I think most people agree that A Storm of Swords is probably the best written book out of them all, but it's not built off of its own foundation. It is very reliant on the books that preceded it, with A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. But A Game of Thrones is, I mean, it really is. You go chapter by chapter, you are offered so much character development, world building, plot development. There's so much backstory that's offered as well, not just for the characters, but also for the world that they live in, the prior conflicts leading up to the moment that we start to get insight into this story when we open up that first, well, you've got the prologue, but once you get past that and you get into the initial chapters of A Game of Thrones, you are immediately brought up to speed, but also with key details missing, which keeps you more intrigued. You know, George R. R. Martin presents questions to us that we're actually very compelled to get answers to. We are very excited to get answers to. Fire and Blood doesn't necessarily do any of this. And the point is that ultimately, A Song of Ice and Fire is a much better presentation of story. We are getting much more rich development for not only plot, characters, and the world building, but we're also being given a story that's maybe more fulfilled as far as its presentation, where Fire and Blood does not do that. So immediately House of the Dragon is given a disadvantage that I don't know that it could ever truly overcome to be the phenomenon, the pop culture phenomenon that Game of Thrones turned out to be. Now, you can be disappointed with how Game of Thrones ended, and I agree with you. I don't like Game of Thrones. I shouldn't say I don't like these seasons, but I am disappointed in the portrayal of these events or the creative liberties and how they kind of stray away from, especially A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons there in the later seasons. Once you hit season 5, Game of Thrones becomes almost unrecognizable compared to the book counterpart. And a lot of people will argue that they ran out of source material, and that's just simply not true, and I don't know why that's so common. And you could argue that, hey, there are certain things that needed to be removed from the book and not presented in the adaptation for Game of Thrones. I agree, because you are telling a story in a different medium. Certain elements need to be presented in a different way for them to have that same impact. The emotional impact, the excitement, the anticipation. It's presented just a little bit differently. And then you've got other elements of the story that are enhanced by a great score by Ramin Djawadi. I just totally butchered his name, and hopefully he'll forgive me, but I'd never say it right anyway. But there's so much that it can be enhanced just in presentation alone. So then the story gets maybe a little bit more lazy, or it can have more narrative hiccups because we're still enthralled by the presentation of the show. And I think that's what Game of Thrones really banked on, especially in the later seasons. Fire and Blood, you know, for all that it is and that it has to go off of, it doesn't have nearly the source material that Game of Thrones has. And if there's just one thing that you're going to walk away from this video knowing that I'm saying, or my conclusion, it's really just that. A Song of Ice and Fire set D&D up in ways that Fire and Blood just never does for Ryan Condal and his crew as they are developing House of the Dragon. A lot of people are going to be disappointed because things are not going to meet their expectations. And because of really the source material, it's almost impossible to adapt this faithfully, because not only does it present itself as unreliable information, but there's so many details, there's so much character development that's not available in this story, that a lot of this stuff is being created from scratch. A lot of it is Ryan Condal's headcanon, and if it's not in harmony with what the audience thinks that happens in the book, well, you're going to have a problem. I think there's two camps of fans for House of the Dragon. There's people that read the book, and then there's people that didn't read the book. And for the people that didn't read the book, they have these moments where they get frustrated when you have maybe a slower moving episode where they're doing more plot development, they're getting into the lore or the history of Westeros, and that's something that the book fans can get really excited about, but your general audience is not going to enjoy that very much. And then on the other side, your book fans, they don't want the spectacle necessarily as much as your more casual viewers who are unfamiliar with the source material. So they try to appease both of us, and when that happens, sometimes they have moments that just make no sense for anybody. It's kind of like Rhaenys jumping up through the dragon pit during Aegon's coronation. Nobody, I don't think many people, maybe there's some out there, but I don't believe that was a very popular thing for either side, whether you're a book fan first and a show fan second, or if you're a show only fan. Moments like that don't make a whole lot of sense, and they don't offer us a lot of payoff. So I think House of the Dragon really struggles with maintaining that balance, and along the process of trying to appease both sides of the fandom, they end up disappointing both of us. I'm a little bit different, where I read Fire and Blood, and I am not a huge fan of the story necessarily, not narratively. There's an outline there, but I'm not enthralled or entrenched into who these characters are based on the source material. And if you are, if there's one thing I would ask you to answer me in the comment sections, it is that, how is it that you have developed these ideas or these concepts of these characters based on general outlines in Fire and Blood, that you hold those so true that you do believe that some of these characters are being quote-unquote butchered? Because I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think these characters had a whole lot to build off of for the showrunners to begin with. So whatever they do with them, yeah, it's going to be original, and it's not going to be consistent with what our assumptions are of these characters. Like, I'm a big fan of the portrayal of Aemond in Fire and Blood, but it's only because it is kind of bare bones, so there's a lot of mystery there. So I start filling in the gaps, and I think a lot of other fans do that too. Now, if I'm alone and you think that the portrayal of any of these characters in Fire and Blood is phenomenal, please let me know. Now, I want to let you know, this video here is not like my official, analysis of book to show adaptation, or my official comparison of Game of Thrones to House of the Dragon. These are some thoughts that I'm constantly having throughout, especially season 2 of House of the Dragon, and that I'm working into a much more professional or appropriate video that maybe has a better presentation style, and it'll be scripted. Where here, I just turn on the microphone as I'm going over my notes of everything I'm working on for this upcoming video. And as I'm going through this, I've got so many questions I want to ask other audiences, and I thought this would be the best way to do it. So what do you guys think? If there's a question I want you guys to answer in the comment section, it would be that. What do you guys think about the inherent disadvantages that House of the Dragon is facing, and how do you think that they are doing as far as trying to overcome maybe these disadvantages that were not present for D&D when they were adapting Game of Thrones? I think Game of Thrones has superior source material, and I think that's undeniable. I think that's objectively true. I think that would be the consensus among most fans, but I'm only asking myself and going off of what I assume is going to be true, and that may not be the case. So please let me know what you guys think. I'm working on a much more appropriate, more official type of video on this specific subject, and I'll try to get to that soon, but I would love to have your guys' input to go off of, and I'll utilize some of that into the next video. And if you want some more House of the Dragon content to hold you over until that next video is out, you can go ahead and click here for more.